first sound Margaret Hale heard was a growl, not the playful rumble she usually heard from her dog when he wanted food or attention. This growl was deeper, slower, a warning. Margaret slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Her body felt heavy and numb, and the cold night air stung her skin like tiny needles. Wet mud pressed against her hands. Her clothes were soaked. Then she heard the rushing water. The river. Memory returned instantly. She had slipped. Pain shot through her leg as she tried to move. The icy current of the Hulahula River had already drained most of her strength before she managed to drag herself halfway onto the muddy bank. She turned her head. Leo stood a few feet away. The small dog's body was stiff, ears raised, eyes fixed on the dark forest beyond the campsite. Another growl rumbled from his throat. Leo rarely growled. In 12 years, Margaret had only heard it a few times. But tonight it sounded different. Tonight it sounded like danger. "Leo," she whispered weakly. But he didn't look at her. His gaze remained locked on the trees. The forest was silent, too silent. Margaret held her breath. At first there was only the river. Then she heard it. A branch snapped. Something was moving in the darkness. Something big. Leo's growl deepened. Fear crept slowly into Margaret's chest. But the truth was, the story of that night had begun long before this moment. 12 years earlier, Margaret Hale had been known as Judge Margaret Hale in Seattle. For more than 30 years, she worked in a busy courthouse, respected for her fairness and strict logic. Emotion rarely entered her courtroom, but life outside it was different. Her husband Daniel died after a long illness. Her son Andrew later moved overseas for work. When Margaret retired at 60, the quiet house became unbearable. She tried reading, gardening, volunteering, but the emptiness remained. One afternoon, she realized she had been staring at the kitchen clock for nearly 2 hours. A week later, she packed her car and began driving north. Eventually, the road led her to Alaska. The vast forests and rivers felt peaceful in a way she hadn't felt in years. That was when she first discovered the Hulahula River. While standing beside the road one afternoon, something small caught her eye. A dog, tiny, soaked in rain, sitting silently beside the road. It wasn't barking or running, just waiting. Margaret hesitated. She had never owned a dog. Someone else would stop. But when she looked back, the little animal was still sitting there in the rain, alone. With a quiet sigh, Margaret walked over and gently picked it up. The small body trembled violently from the cold. "Well," she said softly, wrapping it in a blanket, "you certainly picked a terrible place to wait for help." She placed the dog on the passenger seat. "You're coming with me." Later, she learned the breed was called a Loshan, sometimes known as the little lion dog. She named him Leo. What began as temporary turned into years. Leo followed her everywhere. When she read, he curled beside her chair. When she cooked, he waited patiently nearby. Every morning, he greeted her as if the new day was something wonderful. Slowly, the quiet house felt alive again, and Margaret realized she was no longer alone. The next summer, she returned to Alaska with Leo. It became their tradition. Every year, they camped beside the Hulahula River. For 12 peaceful summers, nothing went wrong. Until the night everything changed. That evening, Leo behaved strangely. Instead of running into the forest like usual, he stayed close to Margaret, glancing toward the trees. Once or twice he growled softly. Margaret laughed it off. "It's probably just the wind," she said. Hours later, she carried a metal cup to the river to rinse it. The rocks were slick. One loose stone shifted under her foot. In a single instant, she slipped down the muddy bank and plunged into the freezing water. The cold shocked her body. Her leg twisted painfully between two rocks. The current pushed hard against her. She clawed desperately at the muddy bank as the river tried to pull her away. Back at the campsite, Leo exploded into barking. He sprinted down to the river. "Leo, stay back." Margaret gasped. But Leo suddenly stopped barking. He turned toward the forest and growled. Margaret followed his gaze. A massive brown bear stepped slowly out of the darkness. Drawn by the noise of the river, Margaret's heart pounded. She was trapped in the water with an injured leg. The bear moved closer. Leo stepped forward. The tiny dog placed himself between the bear and Margaret. "Leo, run," she whispered desperately. But Leo didn't run. He barked, fierce, loud, fearless. The bear paused, surprised by the noise. Leo charged again, barking and snapping before darting back. Again and again he distracted the bear. Every second gave Margaret another chance. Using the last strength she had, she grabbed a branch wedged between two rocks and slowly pulled herself toward the bank. Pain shot through her leg, but she didn't stop. Finally, the bear lost interest in the chaos. With a deep grunt, it turned and disappeared back into the forest. Leo ran immediately to Margaret. She collapsed onto the bank, shaking from cold and exhaustion. Leo whined softly and licked her face. Margaret hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered through tears. The next morning, fishermen spotted smoke from her campsite and called for rescue. When the rescuers heard what happened, they looked down at the tiny dog in disbelief. "That little dog chased off a bear?" Margaret smiled and stroked Leo's fur. "He didn't leave me," she said. Months later, a reporter asked if rescuing Leo years ago had somehow saved her life. Margaret looked down at the small dog sleeping beside her chair. "In court, I spent my life deciding who owed what to whom," she said softly. "But life doesn't work like that." She gently scratched behind Leo's ears. 12 years ago, I found a scared little dog sitting alone in the rain." She smiled. "I thought I rescued him." Her voice softened. "But that night by the Hulahula River, he rescued me.